I'm Helen, 69 years old, and I built a house for my son, and he said, "Don't think you can live here for free." Finally, he paid dearly. Before I continue my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about family betrayal and how to take back your power. Trust me, what happened next will show you exactly how deeply trust can be broken and how decisively it can be reclaimed. I spent over 40 years working at Company A without taking long vacations, sacrificing weekends and holidays to build a solid pension and savings because I thought one day I would enjoy my old age surrounded by family and free from financial worries. When my husband passed away, I still managed to keep the family house in perfect condition and continued paying every bill on time without asking anyone for help, believing my son Jason would one day honor his childhood promise to look after me when I was old. 2 years after the funeral, Jason approached me with what seemed like warmth and concern, insisting that it was too dangerous for a woman my age to live alone, and saying that if I helped them with the down payment for their dream house, I could move in and live as part of their family. I wired $150,000 from my savings into Jason's account without hesitation because I believed in the bond between mother and son and thought I was building a future where we could support one another. For the first year, I cooked every meal, cleaned every room, did every load of laundry, and walked my grandson to and from school every single day without hearing a word of thanks or any recognition that I was holding their household together. When they first asked me to contribute a third of the utilities, I didn't argue because I assumed it was temporary until they adjusted to their mortgage. But soon they insisted I also pay $400 a month toward groceries and reminded me I was not entitled to make decisions about meals or schedules. By the end of the second year, my belongings were relegated to a small corner of the storage room. My husband's photo albums were boxed up and labeled as clutter, and I was told I needed to ask permission before inviting friends over because my presence made their home feel too crowded. Every family holiday became an occasion where I was politely asked to remain in my room so Jason and his wife Emily could entertain their guests without what they called the awkwardness of an elderly parent lingering in the background. It was clear they no longer saw me as family, but as a tenant whose existence was tolerated only because of the money I had already given and the unpaid labor I provided every day without complaint. Then last month, Jason sat me down at the kitchen table and informed me that starting next month I would be required to pay $800 a month in rent because, in his words, it was only natural for an adult living in someone else's house to pay her way. Emily nodded in agreement and added that I should consider myself fortunate they weren't charging me retroactively for the past 3 years since, according to her, no one lives anywhere for free anymore. I reminded them in a calm voice that the $150,000 I contributed was not a loan but the down payment that made it possible for them to own the house at all, and that the agreement from the start was that I would live there as family for the rest of my life. Jason smirked and said circumstances had changed, that financial agreements made years ago couldn't be expected to hold forever, and that if I couldn't manage the rent I should consider moving back to my own house even though they knew I had left it vacant for emergencies like this. Emily crossed her arms and said it was unfair of me to burden their young family with my presence any longer, claiming that my staying there was affecting their ability to enjoy their marriage and making their son anxious because I sometimes watched television after 9 p.m. Jason leaned forward and said that unless I agreed to pay rent immediately they would have no choice but to ask me to leave because, in his words, "We've been more than generous keeping you here this long." I sat perfectly still as I listened to the people I had sacrificed decades of my life for turn on me completely, realizing they saw me not as a mother but as a financial liability and an obstacle to their comfort and plans. At that moment I decided I would not spend another year cooking, cleaning, and sacrificing for people who only valued me when they needed my money or my labor, and I quietly resolved to take back every cent they owed me along with the years of peace they had stolen. I had spent months trying to convince myself that the coldness creeping into their voices was temporary, but every interaction became another reminder that I was no longer seen as a mother or grandmother, but as an intruder whose usefulness had expired once my money secured their mortgage, and my hands maintained their home without asking for a single favor in return. I remembered how Jason had spoken gently when he came to my house 3 years ago, saying he worried about my loneliness and safety and suggesting that by contributing to the down payment I could live surrounded by family rather than growing old alone in silence. And I had believed every word because I thought no son would ever deceive his own mother for financial gain. Emily had smiled as she served tea in my living room and told me she dreamed of a warm, multi-generational household where her son could grow up learning family values from his grandmother while I taught her my recipes and traditions. And I had felt a flicker of hope in my grief after losing my husband that maybe I could still find purpose and belonging with them. When I signed over the transfer of funds and watched Jason thank me profusely, I thought I was securing not just their future but mine as well, because it never occurred to me that my only child would ever weaponize my generosity as leverage to control and discard me. The first year in their home was filled with chores I performed willingly because I wanted to contribute, from preparing meals before sunrise to folding endless piles of laundry and walking my grandson back and forth to school in all weather. But even then I noticed that gratitude was never expressed and boundaries were subtly introduced to remind me I was a guest in a house I had partly purchased. By the time Emily began complaining about the cost of utilities and suggested I pay my share, I had already grown accustomed to biting my tongue and transferring the requested amounts without protest because I didn't want to create tension or appear ungrateful for the chance to live with family. Soon Jason added grocery contributions to the list of my obligations, saying it was only fair since I was eating their food, even though I was the one cooking every meal and often buying additional ingredients with my own pension to ensure everyone's preferences were met. Emily began asking me to limit my time in shared spaces after 8 p.m. so she and Jason could unwind as a couple, and I obeyed without argument even when it meant missing out on family conversations and celebrations because I didn't want to be seen as overstepping. Holidays and birthdays gradually shifted from inclusive gatherings to events where I was informed of plans after they were made, and then politely told that my presence wasn't required because friends and colleagues don't understand the dynamic of an elderly parent living with us. I tolerated every exclusion and insult quietly, convincing myself that tolerance was the price of family harmony, until the day Jason and Emily sat me down and presented me with a new demand for a large sum of money to pay for their son's private school tuition. They spoke as though my initial contribution had been an act of charity owed to them for raising me in their home, and insisted that helping with tuition was the natural next step for any loving grandmother, ignoring the fact that I was already contributing to their bills and labor while receiving none of the rights or respect of a family member. When I reminded them of the original agreement to allow me to live there without additional obligations, Jason dismissed my concerns by saying life circumstances change, and Emily accused me of being selfish for prioritizing my own comfort over my grandson's education. The conversation ended with them reiterating that if I didn't agree to both the tuition and the monthly rent, they would be forced to ask me to leave. And at that moment I felt any remaining illusions I had about their intentions shatter completely. I returned to my room that night not with tears or despair, but with a rising determination to end their exploitation and reclaim my dignity before another year of my life was wasted serving people who viewed me as nothing more than a burden to be managed and a wallet to be emptied. I spent the following days replaying every moment from the past 3 years where I had swallowed my pride and convinced myself that patience and kindness would be enough to heal the widening cracks in our relationship. Yet every memory only reminded me how they had methodically shifted my role from cherished parent to unpaid housekeeper without ever acknowledging the sacrifices I made for them. I recalled how Jason began leaving handwritten lists on the kitchen counter detailing chores I was expected to complete each day, and Emily would casually mention errands she needed me to run while she spent her afternoons at cafes or shopping, always framing her requests as though I should be grateful for the chance to stay busy in my old age. When I tried to explain to them once that I was tired after spending the entire day cleaning, cooking, and taking care of their child, Jason had responded with a laugh and said I should be thankful I wasn't living alone in my old house with no one to talk to, implying that my presence in their home was a privilege I hadn't earned. Emily had stopped even pretending to be polite, telling me outright that I was lucky she tolerated my habits and that younger families deserved space to grow without an elderly parent interfering, which was why she had instituted rules about when I could use the living room, kitchen, and even the laundry machine. When friends called to ask if they could visit, I found myself making excuses because Jason had told me too many visitors created noise and disruption, and the loneliness that settled over me became suffocating even as I continued performing every task asked of me without protest. By the end of the second year, I realized I hadn't spent a single holiday with my grandson because every celebration was either held elsewhere or deliberately arranged during times I was told to remain in my room for their convenience. And yet I was still expected to prepare the meals and clean up after their guests left. Emily began criticizing how I folded clothes, how I seasoned food, and how I spoke to my grandson, as if she were determined to erase any influence I might have had on their family life while still benefiting from my labor and financial contributions. Jason started dropping hints that perhaps I should consider moving back into my old house since I obviously wasn't adjusting well to their routines. A suggestion that ignored the fact they had framed this arrangement as permanent when they persuaded me to part with my savings. The day they handed me an itemized list of expenses they claimed I owed for the past 3 years, utilities, food, and now rent, I felt something inside me harden because I finally understood they had never planned to honor their original promise and were now rewriting history to cast me as a dependent freeloader. I stopped arguing with them altogether because I saw no point in pleading for kindness from people who no longer viewed me as family, and instead I began using every spare moment to quietly gather the documents and evidence I needed to prepare for the confrontation I knew was coming. At night, while they slept peacefully in the home I helped them secure, I sat in my room organizing bank statements, original agreements, and copies of every transfer I had made into Jason's account, realizing that the only way to protect myself was to stop being the accommodating mother they assumed would never fight back. I no longer spoke unless spoken to, and even then I answered with short, measured words because every interaction had become another reminder that I was invisible in a house where I had once been welcomed with open arms, yet still expected to clean, cook, and care for their child as if I were a servant without wages or boundaries. Emily had begun locking the kitchen cabinets when she was out and leaving me a separate list of ingredients I was allowed to use for my meals, claiming their family needed to budget carefully, though I was the one paying nearly half of the grocery costs and spending hours each day preparing food that they devoured without hesitation. Jason avoided me entirely unless he needed me to take his son to after-school lessons, pick up dry cleaning, or wait at home for package deliveries, treating me like hired help whose only value was in fulfilling tasks so he and Emily could enjoy their careers and social lives without interruption. Their son, who once ran into my arms every afternoon, now hesitated at the doorway to my room because Emily had told him repeatedly that I was too tired or too busy to play, slowly erasing the bond we had built in the early days when I was still part of their family. On the rare occasions when I sat in the living room before 9 p.m., Emily would appear and pointedly remind me of her rule that the space was reserved for her family's relaxation, forcing me to retreat like an intruder to the small room they had assigned me, where even my late husband's photos had been hidden away in boxes labeled miscellaneous. Jason had the audacity to complain to relatives about how difficult it was to support an elderly parent, framing me as a burden when the reality was that I had given them more than most parents could ever afford and worked tirelessly to keep their household running smoothly. When I overheard Emily on the phone telling a friend that she couldn't wait for me to move back to my old house so they could finally breathe again, I realized she had no intention of ever treating me as family and saw me only as an obstacle standing between her and the comfortable lifestyle my money had helped secure. The final blow came when Jason handed me a formal notice demanding I either start paying rent immediately or vacate within 60 days. An ultimatum that made it clear they saw me as nothing more than a tenant despite the fact I had funded the very foundation of their home. That night I stared at the notice in my hands and decided I would no longer tolerate their hypocrisy, their double standards, or their rewriting of history to make me appear as a dependent old woman instead of the mother who had sacrificed everything for their success. The morning after receiving their ultimatum, I acted as though nothing had changed because I knew that any sign of resistance would only embolden them to escalate their demands. Yet inside I was already calculating every step required to dismantle the false narrative they had built about my dependence and to reclaim not just my money but my dignity. Jason spoke casually at breakfast about the upcoming tuition payment for his son's private school, reminding me that family supports family, and suggesting I should feel honored to contribute another $10,000 annually since I had no real expenses beyond the utilities and groceries he insisted I owed. Emily added that as the grandmother it was only natural for me to help ensure their son's future success, her tone laced with condescension, as though I had somehow forgotten the $150,000 I had already transferred into their account to secure the very roof over their heads. I sat silently while they outlined the financial plan they expected me to follow, noting how they spoke of me as if I were an obligation to be managed, and not a person who had spent decades sacrificing her own comforts to raise a son who now saw her as a wallet with legs. Later that afternoon, Jason handed me a printed document summarizing their expectations: $800 monthly rent, continued contributions to food and utilities, and annual tuition support for their child, all presented as though I had no choice but to comply if I wished to avoid being evicted. Emily glanced at me with a look of triumph, as if she believed her years of subtle manipulation had finally succeeded in subduing me. But what she didn't know was that I had already located the original conditional gift agreement signed 3 years ago and was preparing to use it as the cornerstone of my response. That night, while they watched television in the living room from which I was now effectively banned, I sat in my small room reviewing every financial record, bank transfer slip, and email exchange from the past 3 years, building a timeline of evidence that documented not only my financial support but also their escalating pattern of exclusion and emotional abuse. I contacted lawyer A, the same attorney who had assisted my late husband years earlier, and explained the situation in detail, carefully outlining how my initial contribution was contingent upon the agreement that I would live in the house as a family member for the remainder of my life. The lawyer confirmed my suspicion that their demand for rent and attempts to evict me constituted a breach of the original agreement, and assured me that I had full legal grounds to demand repayment of the $150,000 along with compensation for the unpaid labor I had provided for 3 years. I scheduled a meeting at Lawyer A's office for later that week and spent the next 2 days gathering every document they might need, including copies of the text messages and emails where Jason and Emily had acknowledged my contribution and the conditions attached to it. By the time I placed all the files into a neat folder and set it beside my handbag, I felt a clarity and resolve I hadn't experienced in years because I knew the time had come to stop begging for respect from people who had already decided I was expendable. I walked into Lawyer A's office with every relevant document organized and annotated because I refused to let Jason and Emily rewrite history again or dismiss my contribution as a simple gift freely given without conditions. The lawyer reviewed the conditional gift agreement and immediately pointed out that the clause specifying cohabitation as part of the arrangement gave me the legal right to demand full repayment if they forced me out or imposed terms that effectively terminated our shared living arrangement. I listened as the lawyer explained in clear terms that their attempt to charge me rent, combined with their exclusion of me from household life and their demand for additional tuition money, could be interpreted as a deliberate breach of contract that undermined the original agreement. When the lawyer asked what outcome I wanted, I answered without hesitation that I wanted my money returned in full and that I intended to sell my own house, secure a new residence, and sever all ties with my son and his wife because I no longer believed reconciliation was possible after the betrayal I had endured. The lawyer assured me that a formal demand letter could be sent within a week and that if Jason and Emily refused repayment voluntarily, legal action would proceed to enforce repayment through the courts, including the possibility of placing a lien on their house. Leaving the office, I felt no fear or regret because I had finally acknowledged the truth that Jason and Emily were not acting out of ignorance or stress but out of calculated self-interest that had no place for the mother who had sacrificed everything for their stability. I called a real estate agent later that day and requested an appraisal of my old house, which had been sitting vacant for 3 years, and was surprised to learn its value had increased significantly due to market demand in the area. The agent estimated a sale price that would give me enough to purchase a smaller, more manageable apartment outright and still leave me with substantial savings for the years ahead, freeing me from any future dependence on Jason or Emily. Over the next few days I met with the agent, signed the necessary paperwork, and began packing the few personal items I had brought into their home, careful to keep my plans secret so Jason and Emily would not have time to interfere or manipulate me into staying. I arranged to view a series of apartments and found one with excellent accessibility features, a secure building, and shared amenities that would allow me to live comfortably without relying on anyone, and I placed a deposit to hold the unit until the sale of my house closed. As I finalized these preparations, I kept up the appearance of compliance in Jason and Emily's home, cooking their meals and completing chores as usual because I wanted them to remain unaware until the day my lawyer's letter arrived with a demand for the return of every cent they owed me. When the sale of my house closed for a price even higher than the agent's initial estimate, I transferred the proceeds into a separate account that Jason and Emily could not access or even know about because I had already decided they would never again have any claim over my finances or my future. The apartment I had chosen was now fully secured with my deposit, and the remaining balance would be paid in full from the sale of my house once the legal process recovered the $150,000 I had given Jason under false pretenses of lifelong family cohabitation. I confirmed with the lawyer that the demand letter would be hand-delivered to Jason and Emily within 72 hours, and I arranged to have movers scheduled to retrieve my few belongings on the same day because I wanted the separation to be complete and irreversible. As I continued performing daily tasks in their home without complaint, Jason and Emily mistook my silence for resignation and even commented to each other in my presence that it seemed I had finally accepted my place and would likely agree to pay rent without further argument. Emily boasted on the phone to a friend that once I started paying $800 a month, they could refinance their mortgage to free up cash for vacations and home renovations, revealing how little they valued the labor and money I had already invested in their comfort. Jason spoke casually about enrolling their son in an expensive summer camp, confident that my pension would cover the tuition because, in his words, it's what any responsible grandmother would want for her grandson's future. I responded with nothing more than a polite nod because I knew that within days they would be confronted with the reality that their manipulation and greed had consequences they were entirely unprepared to face. The night before the demand letter was to be delivered, I finished packing my few remaining personal items into suitcases and boxes, labeling them discreetly so they could be loaded and transported without causing suspicion when the movers arrived. I slept soundly for the first time in years because I no longer felt trapped in a cycle of servitude and emotional abuse, knowing that the next day would mark the end of their control over my life and the beginning of my freedom. At exactly 10 a.m. the following morning, as Jason and Emily were settling into their usual routine, the doorbell rang and lawyer A entered with a calm but firm demeanor, carrying the documents that would dismantle their illusion of power in a single devastating moment. When lawyer A stepped inside with the formal demand letter, Jason's face shifted from confusion to panic as he read the words outlining their breach of contract and the immediate requirement to repay the $150,000 that had secured their mortgage 3 years earlier. Emily, standing behind him, demanded to know what authority the lawyer had to deliver such a message and insisted that the money had been a gift, her voice rising as if sheer volume could erase the written agreement that explicitly tied my contribution to lifelong cohabitation. The lawyer calmly presented a copy of the signed document with their signatures clearly visible next to the clause stating that my financial assistance was contingent on my right to reside in the home without additional rent or conditions, a clause they had violated repeatedly with their demands and exclusions. Jason stammered that he never intended for things to escalate like this and tried to appeal to me by invoking family ties. Yet every word he spoke only reminded me how quickly those ties had been severed the moment I was no longer convenient for their plans. Emily accused me of betrayal and claimed I was tearing their family apart for money, ignoring the reality that I had spent 3 years sacrificing my time, labor, and emotional well-being for people who saw me only as a burden to be managed and a wallet to be emptied. The lawyer informed them that failure to comply with the repayment demand would result in legal proceedings, including the potential for a lien against their property and wage garnishment to satisfy the debt, leaving them visibly shaken as they began to comprehend the consequences of their actions. Jason asked for time to consider the situation and promised they would find a way to make things right. But I had already decided there would be no further negotiations or second chances because I could not risk falling back into the same cycle of exploitation and broken promises. I stood silently as the lawyer handed them the final page of the document detailing the deadline for repayment, watching as Emily's hands trembled and Jason buried his face in his palms because for the first time they were forced to confront the cost of their selfishness. As the lawyer and I left their home for the last time, I felt no desire to look back or offer words of comfort because the years of unpaid labor, unacknowledged sacrifices, and emotional humiliation they had inflicted could not be erased with a few hollow apologies. The moving van arrived an hour later, and I directed the workers to take my boxes directly to the apartment I had secured in advance, ensuring that by the end of the day every trace of my presence in Jason and Emily's household would be gone forever. From the moment I settled into my new apartment, I felt the weight of 3 years of silent endurance lift from my shoulders because I no longer had to measure every word, every step, and every breath to avoid offending people who had never intended to treat me as family. Jason and Emily soon learned that the repayment deadline was not a suggestion when the lawyer filed official papers initiating legal proceedings that threatened to seize their home if they failed to comply. And suddenly the confidence they once flaunted turned into desperation. Emily began working extra shifts and Jason extended his hours at the office. Yet their combined income was insufficient to cover both their regular mortgage payments and the additional debt they now owed to me because they had built their lives on the false belief that my generosity was endless. Relatives who had once praised Jason for taking in his elderly mother now heard the other side of the story when I calmly explained how much I had contributed and how I had been repaid with demands, exclusion, and ultimatums designed to push me out once they no longer needed me. Their social circle, once so eager to attend parties at their house, began to shrink as whispers spread about the lawsuit and their financial troubles, leaving Emily humiliated and Jason increasingly isolated as they faced the consequences of their greed. Their son, no longer seeing me every day, asked where I had gone and why I didn't come to pick him up from school anymore, but Jason could not bring himself to explain the truth because it would mean admitting that he and his wife had chosen money and comfort over family loyalty. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Emily now handled all the cleaning, cooking, and childcare herself while resenting every moment of the unpaid labor she had once demanded of me without gratitude, and Jason struggled to keep up with overtime while their financial situation grew more precarious. Meanwhile, I attended social gatherings, explored new hobbies, and even joined a local club where I made friends who valued my company without expecting me to cook their meals or raise their children, enjoying a level of freedom I had forgotten was possible. When I spotted Jason one afternoon in the distance, standing outside a bank with a weary expression and slumped shoulders, I turned away without hesitation because I refused to let his struggles undo the resolve that had saved me from years of further exploitation. For the first time in decades, I felt fully in control of my life, and I knew I would never again surrender that freedom to anyone, no matter how close they claimed to be. The court ruled in my favor within weeks because the evidence was undeniable, and Jason and Emily were ordered to repay the full $150,000 along with legal fees, a judgment that left them scrambling to refinance their mortgage and liquidate savings just to keep their home. I never once contacted them during the process because I had nothing left to say to people who had already shown me exactly how little I meant to them once my usefulness ran out, and I refused to reopen wounds that were finally beginning to heal. Neighbors later told me that Emily had started selling personal items online to make ends meet while Jason quietly borrowed money from distant relatives, none of whom offered sympathy once they learned how he had treated his own mother. Their son asked about me so often that Jason reportedly snapped one night, telling him I had abandoned the family, but even a child could sense the truth because he remembered the years I spent walking him to school, helping with his homework, and sitting by his side when his parents were too busy. I never responded to Jason's email asking if we could meet to talk things through, because I knew it was not an apology but a plea for relief from the crushing reality of the debt and responsibilities he had once mocked me for carrying alone. Each morning in my new apartment began with simple routines I had not experienced in years: making breakfast only for myself, choosing activities without accommodating others, and reading in silence without fear of interruption or criticism. Friends who had once pitied my situation now visited regularly to drink tea, share laughter, and tell me I seemed stronger and more alive than ever, and I agreed because leaving behind the constant demands and disrespect had given me a second chance at life. When I thought about Jason and Emily's downfall, I felt no joy or revenge because their suffering was not a victory but a consequence they created themselves when they chose greed over gratitude and manipulation over compassion. I decided I would spend whatever years remained embracing peace and self-respect because I had learned that no amount of sacrifice could earn love from those determined to exploit it, and I would never again allow anyone to take from me what I was unwilling to give. The day I closed the final chapter on my relationship with Jason, I whispered to myself that family is not defined by blood but by how we treat each other, and I smiled knowing my life no longer belonged to anyone but me. As I sit here now in the quiet of my own home, I no longer feel the weight of unspoken expectations or the suffocating guilt that once kept me tethered to people who saw my existence as negotiable. Every morning begins with choices that are mine alone, free from lists of tasks or voices reminding me I owe more simply because I gave before, and I move through my days knowing that peace does not come from sacrifice but from boundaries fiercely protected. I think often of the women I've met who still endure similar indignities in silence, believing that love requires endless giving, and I wish I could tell each of them that there is nothing selfish about reclaiming what is rightfully theirs. We are not burdens simply because we age, nor are we dispensable because we no longer serve someone else's plans, and the moment we stop believing those lies is the moment our lives can begin again on our own terms. Jason and Emily's faces no longer haunt me at night because I have let go of the need for their understanding or apology, knowing some lessons are only learned when the comfort built on someone else's sacrifice finally collapses. I am not bitter, and I am not broken. I am simply free, and freedom is a gift I now guard as closely as I once guarded my family's well-being. For anyone listening who feels unseen in their own home or unappreciated by those they love, I want you to know it is never too late to step away, to say no, and to begin again without permission. This is not the end of my story. It is only the beginning.